Hi class, so I wanted to demo what I'm looking for your half self-portrait exercise. And I'm also taking this opportunity to demo how the oil paint works for those of you that are interested in the oil paint. So I have a reference image here that I hope you can see, and in the previous video I mixed up a light flesh tone, a dark shadow flesh tone, and two midtones that I'll be using to do this self-portrait. And I'll tell you right now that as well as I think I can mix on the palette, as soon as it goes on the canvas it can look totally different. And so you have to be ready to call it if it looks too pink or if it's too muppety and too saturated. You have to call it. There's an incredible amount of white that gets mixed into lighter flesh tones. So you can see this is how I made my decisions. This is the highlight tone. This is the mid-tone that's lighter. This is the mid-tone that's darker. And then this stands in for my shadow tone. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to block in. And so as I mentioned before, I'm using oil paint, and so oil paint can take days to dry. I can bet that none of this will be dry in a day, and so there are advantages to the acrylic paint that you guys have been working with. And so I'm going to be able to show you guys dry brushing. After I painted everything, I can take a soft brush and blend everything together. With acrylic paint it would be dry almost instantly, but with oil paint it stays wet so long that you have time to do a lot of blending. So I am going to quickly block in. And as I'm blocking in, I'm going to talk to you guys about oil paint. So oil paint was invented way before acrylic paint. Acrylic paint was invented in this century, I believe, and it's a plastic that holds the pigment. One interesting thing about paint is that the pigment's the same no matter if you're using oil paint or pastel or acrylic paint or watercolor. It's the same pigment, just a different carrier, just a different binder. And oil paint was first. And oil paint was, I hear, invented to emulate human flesh. And like I mentioned in the last video, human flesh is a very complex color because it is made up of translucent layers, and that's one of the best things that oil paint can do. It can be layered to create complex colors. So I went in to create some defining lines for my eyes. Now I'm blocking in a little bit for some of my features, and I'm going to go in to my different tones and block in. Alright, so now well, I guess I'll just do the top half of my face for you all. Alright. So I'm going to start blocking in. I'm going to jump into that mid-tone, and like I said, you got to be ready to call it. This looks completely different than what I'm looking at. My reference, it needs a lot more red. Okay, so I added a bit of a red tone to it. There we go, that's closer. Red and burnt sienna, which is reddish. So I'm going to ask myself to, where else can I put this color? Keep in mind that I have a day to blend this, unlike acrylic. Okay, Then I'm going to jump over, grab some of my shadow tone. I know my shadow tone was a little too dark, maybe not that light. Oh yeah, so anyway, oil paint, as I mentioned before, uses Gamsol instead of water. You never add water to oil paint. The rule with using oil paint and acrylic on the same painting is that you can, but you never use them at the same time, and acrylic has to go on first. And then once it's dry, then you can go in with oil paint. That's actually what I do for most of my paintings. And the reason why I do that is because acrylic dries so fast that I can move a lot faster when working in acrylic. So starting a painting, I don't need days for the paint to dry when I'm just blocking in the general darks, lights, midtones. To add a bit more darkness. So I'm just generally placing the paint where I see the value. Remember to clean off your brush every time you're jumping to a different tone. Now I'm going to go into my lighter mid-tone. This too could use some tweaking. I think it needs a little bit more white. And more white. A lot of light, more light's catching on the brow ridge. Interesting thing about trying to make an area lighter on the face, it doesn't always work to just keep adding white. Oftentimes the effect of lightness is relative, and so you have to adjust the rest of the paint, and then something will feel lighter in relation to what else is there. Okay. I'm going to change to a slightly smaller brush. So I'm going to keep blocking in, but I'm just going to do it a little more carefully. So because you use the Gamsol solvent instead of water, it does give off some fumes. Gamsol is the safest solvent to use with oil paint, but it can still give people headaches and things like that. So I try to just minimize my contact with it while I'm inside. So I'm almost done blocking in, and I can show you guys dry brushing. So continuing here. Almost ready. A bit of paint in for the eyes. You always want to get rid of the majority of white on your canvas no matter what you're doing. It usually does not serve you to leave that. Okay, almost done. Just for the sake of time and for what you are all doing, I'm just going to do above the nose. I'm just leaving those there so I can keep track of where the nostrils should be. All right. So now that I have my values generally where they need to be, pretty general right now, I'm going to show you guys dry brushing, which, actually let me do the hair first, and I'll just talk to you about what dry brushing is. Because this is all still wet, it's all blendable right now. And so, with one rag in your hand, you can really effectively blend everything carefully. I call it sculpting with the paint. It's pushing the paint around and I call it sculpting with the paint because every little millimeter that you push that paint, it changes what form you're telling the viewer they're looking at. And so it feels like sculpting to me because you're giving the illusion of 3 dimensions with 2 dimensions. Alright, so now I'm going to dry brush now that I got some hair. Well, I got some black brown, I'm just going to add that. The values need to deepen a little. Okay, so now my values. Oh, not quite. Okay. All right, so the way dry brushing works is you should, let me find a good brush for it. Soft brushes I find are really good for dry brushing, but let's try this one first. So the reason why you need to hold a rag in your hand while you are dry brushing is because if too much paint accumulates on the brush, it's not going to just be blending anymore, it's going to actually be painting and depositing paint. And sometimes I use that to my advantage, but most of the time it's not too handy. Oh, I forgot a bit of eyeball. And be generous with your paint for the dry brushing technique. The more paint you have, better it'll probably look. Okay, so just gotta get that in. Okay. So about that. Alright, so now I have enough paint to dry brush. So, let me show you how this works. Basically, I'm watching my reference image very carefully, and I'm blending the still wet oil paint to where I think the different values should go and how they should interact. And sometimes dry brushing is quite effective, and other times you need to be a little more delicate. My paintings, I often will dry brush at least at some point the oil paint. This brush is a little too large to be dry brushing the smaller details. I will use it to do these big larger moments. I'm going to catch some reflected light on this cheek. That contour was off. Okay, so I just took a bit of that cheek paint and I'm gonna sneak it into the cheek and shadow because it gets a little lighter there. I'm going to try a different brush with the dry brushing now. This is a stiffer, more circular brush, so that I get a little texture as I'm dry brushing. Oil paints, long dry time, I find very useful for all sorts of reasons, blending especially, but to be able to do something like glazing at your leisure. I also like being able to start something in oil paint on a dry painting, and if it doesn't work out, I just wipe it off and it leaves no trace. Okay, I'm trying to blend in a way that helps support the form of what I'm painting. This stiffer brush is definitely leaving visible brush strokes, which I can use to my advantage if I can angle the brush correctly. But switch to a smaller brush to dry brush. Sneak a little bit of white over here. One nice thing about flesh tone is that if you don't get it quite right, and most of the time I don't in the first go through, oftentimes my flesh tone won't have enough yellow in it, or it may not have enough red or not the right red, or sometimes it can be missing brown. If that happens when it's dry, when the painting is dry, I like to glaze it, which is just to put a semi-translucent layer of paint to just shift those colors slightly to where I need them to be. That's why I focus more on the values, lights and darks, and I deal with color after. So over here is a good example of how where you dry brush, the form's going to change. Wherever the highlight starts is where this tells the viewer that cheekbone is. Do a little dry brushing around the eyes. You usually slow down quite a bit around the eyes. Because it's so important. It's a little too contaminated. So it looks just like water the Gamasol. Don't drink it, don't huff it. So this is the biggest problem with oil paint, is that because it takes so long to dry, it's very easy to accumulate too much paint on the surface to make the kind of changes that you want to make. For example, say I want to lighten up this eye. There's so much black paint that I really would need to wait for it to dry or actually scrape off some of the paint. Wipe it off, and I do that quite often when I'm working in oil paint. So you can see there's a bit of color catching in my iris there. Assessing the contour to get some brown into this eye. And the term the white of the eye is a misnomer. Depending on the light situation, the white of the eye can be black or gray. This dark tone on my brush, I can try to push where some of those darker shadows need to be.